Welcome back to Pro Running News. Matt Fox, Dave Littman speaking all about double threshold days, a trend in the distance running world at the moment. Dave, you've been reading into this quite a lot recently, and I've been very interested, and we've been listening to other podcasts about it. Let's get started.
Yeah. Popularized quite a while ago. I won't profess any level of historical understanding. I know the piece that is easiest for people to access is linked in the show notes here by Marius Bakken. It sounds like this traces back to Norwegian heritage and use in Norway, but I'm sure that someone can correct me on that. But I know Stephen Scullion's talked a bit about this. I find it interesting. I find training theory fascinating from my exercise science background. But I guess the first thing is, what is a double threshold day?
From what I understand, it is 2 threshold sessions in a day. So it's one in the morning and one in the evening, or it could be, I guess it could be 2 in the morning, but it's 2 workouts in a day, right around that threshold effort, LT1, although on occasion, LT2, on occasion, there could be a mixture of both. There could also be a mixture of long sustained efforts. There could be shorter efforts, 400s, 600s, 1Ks with short rest. I know quite commonly used by the Ingebrigtsens. They quite commonly would do 5 to 6 minute intervals in the morning, often on the treadmill, sometimes not. In the evening, they'd sometimes do even 400s or 800s or 1Ks at threshold, so not all out at threshold with very short rest, sometimes 30 seconds. Is that correct?
Yeah, thereabouts. So. Yep. I guess defining the thresholds is the first threshold LT1, the second threshold is LT2. These are those are lactate threshold 1 and 2, LT. There's also, these correlate with the ventilatory thresholds, VT 1 and 2. But sometimes LT1 is called obla, so onset of blood lactate accumulation, so when you start to accumulate some lactate. And then LT2 is what they call maximum lactate steady state, which means is that's a level at which you've gone above baseline. Now you're roughly at a steady state, it stays about there, and then beyond that LT2, it starts to go up, right? So you start to accumulate stuff, and generally exponentially almost. So you see these classic curves, and we've linked to a paper here, 2009 paper, that you can see all these classic curves and explains all of this stuff in detail. But in short, these guys are trying to accumulate a ton of time, what sounds like between LT1 and LT2. So I guess one of the challenges in running is people love to brand things and label things, threshold, tempo, these sort of things, and not talk about physiological limits. These have almost no meaning. So within this is also where LT1 is, and this depends on how you do it. And I'm not going to get into this. I'm not going to profess a level of true proficiency with this, but there is debate here. Some people say it's 2 millimolar. Some people say it's the initial inflection point. Some people say it's the initial inflection post reduction. It's semantics here. Long story short is below LT1 is basically all day pace. It's very easy. This is traditionally zone 1 in a 3-zone model. Between the two is zone 2 in a 3-zone model. And above LT2 is zone 3 in a 3-zone model. Now the 5-zone models are different. I'm not going to get into that too much, but you have 2 zones below the first threshold, and you got a zone between, and you got 2 zones above it. And then there's a 7-zone model, and all this stuff popularized by different things. So I guess the most important thing is understanding your lactate curve, because just training to a certain lactate isn't the answer. That's what some people think is happening. It's absolutely not the answer. You need to understand your curve and understand how it's changing, because it will change in response to training. And this is the whole thesis of double threshold training, is changing this ability to run for a prolonged period of time at maximum lactate steady state. That's effectively what it boils down to, because that is the rate limiter, as Marius Bakken postulates, is that the rate limiter for 5-10K runners.
Mm-hmm. So why 2 in a day?
Why 2 in a day? So this is an interesting thing. They talk about concentrating the stress and accumulating running at this pace. Really, it's about, fundamentally, the view here, and it's a view held by arguably the most interesting coach in the world at the moment, Olaf Andersen, who coaches Gustav Iden and Christian Blumenfeld, who get a big run on a running podcast. But the theory here is basically more volume is better, right? And more volume in intense work is better. So these guys are trying to accumulate as much volume as they can, running at a pace that is that is a good stimulus to clear lactate, so that you can improve your LT2, really. So they're trying to stress the system so it has to deal with a bit more lactate to then be able to clear it, so they can sustain more work there. The counterpoint to this, or the part of the reason they do it at the intensity they do it at, is to limit muscular injury risk or limit muscular issues. So this is really important to understand the difference here, because not all endurance training is the same. right? So triathlon training is not the same as cycling training, it's not the same as running training. And probably the biggest difference is that in cycling training and triathlon training, it's not all running.
No.
And when it's all running, you have rate limiters that are not necessarily physiological. Some of them are more musculoskeletal, right? The pounding of running. Not that I believe it's injury inducing, but like your tolerance to that is the challenge, right? So you may not be able to do, if I ask you to run a 200 kilometer week next week, you may get injured. And if you don't, you may in 2 more weeks of running 200 kilometers, right? And that's, adding bike time is not the same risk for the total duration of hours trained. So this is why you can have triathletes who can train 30 hours a week plus. I don't know any runners who do that. Not even close to 30 hours a week.
No. So from Marius Buchan's website, the Norwegian model, link in the show notes, interesting, about 10-15% down the page. Just an interesting quote I found while reading through this. So, quote, my own journey into this concept started when my results began stagnating between 1996 and 1998 when I was training for middle distances. During that period, I had the father of Sebastian Coe, Peter Coe, coaching me. He had me focus on more intense training with elements of aerobic conditioning. At the time, he had interesting elements of blocking that he would call top-up mileage weeks that I responded better to. Writing this article, I found an example of this back from 1997. Some of the letters from Peter. Later, this type of blocking clustering of training became more and more important in the model, not only on a week-to-week periodization, but also within a single training day. It then goes on to talk about the sweet spot of training zone, and another interesting quote. I soon found out that the lowering the lactate level from the standard level of 4.0 millimeters per mmol/L down initially from 3.0, usually staying from 2.3 up to 3.0 on sessions, gave not only far better results, you could also do huge amounts of threshold training, substantially more versus a level of close to 4.0 without wearing down. So it sounds like he discovered that, slightly going above that 3.5 or 3 millimoles per liter was a sort of an exponentially more difficult thing to sustain, whereas being able to do a lot of work around that 2 to 2.5, 2.3 to 3, he says here. I've also heard of people training around 1.8, so I guess right around that 2 to 2.5 is the sweet spot for most, but I think that's a little bit individual.
Yeah, and he's also talking a bit about here, to bring it back away from the millimole measurements, which will sort of be a bit hard for people to grasp onto. No one thinks that your half marathon pace and your 10-mile pace are equally sustainable, right? And this is fundamentally kind of what we're talking about here, is a change like that. So the difference between, say, 2 millimole or 2.5 millimolar and, say, 4 millimolar, you may still be below second threshold, or LT2, or whatever you want to call it, maximum lactate steady state. So you're still in a threshold zone, you're still in zone 2, but it's where in that zone you are. So you at a thing you can sustain for more like an hour, or are you at things that you can sustain for more like 2 hours, and that's very different. So it's really important to understand that that's kind of what we're talking about in there, is we're playing around with small differences in pace, but that's a huge difference in the tolerance for total running volume at that pace in a day. So if I asked you, Matt, to run something like 340 per kilometer versus 330 per kilometer and accumulate volume at that in a day, you'd be a lot more comfortable accumulating a lot more volume at 340 than 330.
Yeah.
And that's really what he's talking about here, is just a slight change there in that. He also goes on to talk about going to Kenya and testing a bunch of Kenyan runners, which is really interesting given they are not training like he is, and they have no exposure to this, right? So they are not optimizing for lactate. They're not looking at lactate, they're not optimizing for it, assuming this is in the 90s as well. This is, probably the GPS watch getting too much to Kenya. So worthwhile considering that, and then the impact of their training on it. And what he's found is that they actually tend to hold lower lactates and tend to accumulate volume at this pace really intuitively and well, which is a really interesting discussion, because you and I have talked a lot about the difference between Kenya and, say, Norway, and can you take Norwegian training to Kenya, can you take Kenyan training elsewhere, and the importance of culturally appropriate buy-in and in the way we train and why we train the way we train, right? So we're both Australian. Traditional Australian models are things like VO2 max intervals one day, threshold run another day, maybe hills on a third day, and be done. With a long run on a Sunday, maybe a hilly midweek long run, right? That's a really classic Australian template for distance runners, but it's not what the Norwegians are doing, it's not what the Kenyans do, and the question is why, and how can these all be successful, which one's the best, right? And everyone wants to know which one's the best. which is really interesting. I mean, to go with a double threshold day, it's really important to remember they're not doing one of those a week. They're doing 2 of those a week. So 2 double threshold days. And they do a hard hill session, or not a hard hill session, but a hill session as well on a third day. So really they're trying to accumulate probably less intensity or less intense stress, although above easy running. They're trying to accumulate a large volume of that. Is probably the easiest way to think about it. So instead of really hard or really easy, they're hitting a bit more in the grey zone in the middle, but they're accumulating a ton of that. And they're accumulating it across at least 2 days, perhaps 3. And he postulates, is there a way to add a third training session in on these double threshold days? Could you do a third one? And that's, I mean, I've heard stories of, from a different sport of weightlifters from Eastern Bloc countries doing an intense work block and having a 25-minute rest and then doing another one rather than continue to go. And this is weightlifting, but there's something here which is how are we accumulating stress and what systems are we stressing, right? So this is kind of what he's talking about. He says the muscles recover. He talks a lot about the tone of muscles, Marius Bakken does. So he's saying the muscles recover, but the metabolism is still stressed, and then you can go again in the evening. And it's foreseeable that you have lower glycogen stores in the evening, so there might be a stimulus there, all those things.
Yeah, there's lots of really interesting information and quotes in this document, especially around the Kenyan thing that you mentioned, mechanical benefits versus increasing the threshold and Kenya. I mean, looking at the Kenyans training and the Norwegians training, they almost couldn't be too much different. But when you look at the Olympic final and the World Champs final, it's normally Kenyans versus Ingebrigtsen. So I don't think there's a right and wrong here. But yeah, I think one interesting thing though that so double threshold days are also quite commonly used by Renato Canova, and many people would know who he is a coach of many of the world's best distance runners, 10K, mostly 10K through to marathon. He has coached a few pretty successful steeplechasers and 1500 runners. But one interesting thing that I asked him about a year and a half ago on a Kenyan training camp was there has been this idea that you shouldn't consume carbohydrates between the 2 workouts to completely deplete your carbohydrate stores. He said that he never said that. He said that that's something that someone has made up and run with. But when I asked him, is it a good idea? He said, probably not. It just probably increases the risk of sort of injury and burnout and the second session being pretty bad. But he was a little bit confused at the whole idea that someone came up with that. So it's worth pointing that out for people that believe that. And I got that straight from his mouth. Yeah. It
probably comes from the train low, train high sort of carbohydrate periodization model in the nutrition research. And there's some thoughts around this, like second run should be low carbohydrate availability, so you're bumping up fat oxidation pathways.
Yep.
Really trying to have your cake and eat it too, so to speak, metabolically, because as you improve fat oxidation rates, you sort of sacrifice some carb oxidation rates. So trying to sort of balance those two and get the best of both worlds. I think I've done bits of this. I think it's, it is what it is. Like if you can't eat, you can't eat. If you can, you can. The quality of the second session is definitely better if you've eaten. There's no question, particularly carbohydrates. And I think if you're trying to do any intensity, you need carbohydrates there. Maybe even, okay, I can't eat, so then you do it during, right? You're having your sipping on carbs. It's not the same, but it's helpful. But without overstepping my boundaries in terms of nutrition knowledge, one thing I'd say is that my reading of the literature suggests that probably the best stimulus of fat oxidation rate is endurance training rather than diet or all these things. So there's definitely a component of that to consider. And also what you burn is so dependent on your last meal. It's not even funny. It makes, I don't want to say it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint because it's a bit of a silly way to develop an argument, but it makes sense to burn what you have available, right? And try and use that. So one thing that is helpful for me, and I learned this in medicine, was if there's 3 treatments for something, it's because neither of them are the best. And so if there are multiple ways to train, it's probably because neither of them are the best. It's because they all have value. They all have drawbacks. They all have benefits. And until we get to a point, and maybe we're too early in this, right? We don't have the data yet. And there will be. Maybe it's double threshold. Maybe it's not double threshold. That becomes the panacea and it's the best. But until that point, while there's no best, it means that they're probably all valuable. And I think sometimes people misconstrue, and this is really hard to delineate out in research, is what's the effect of changing my training versus what's the effect of changing it to something. So if we weren't doing double threshold days, all of a sudden start doing double threshold days, it's not surprising that we get an improvement because we've changed the stimulus. Conversely, if we're doing a ton of that and we change away from it, we're probably going to see a benefit too. And neither of those are related necessarily to what we've changed to or from as much as the change itself. And that's a super valuable way to think about it. And perhaps the optimal ends up being mixes of all of this stuff, right? You're mixing in some really classically Kenyan stuff with some classically Norwegian stuff and maybe some like hybrid Canova stuff goes in there.
In your opinion, I mean, neither of us, I would say, are complete experts in double threshold days. We've researched quite a bit. And have you ever tried for a double threshold day?
No, I don't have I mean, I've only ever done a little bit of double running in a day, just based on, again, my risk factors are to do with musculoskeletal system. So it's only recently I've been able to tolerate running more than 5 days a week.
Right.
Some of those previously was 5 days with using a similar theory, which is like, let's stress up a certain day. So I would do a session in the morning and a jog in the afternoon, evening. And I would do that to really concentrate and then recover on other days. But I haven't done a lot of these double threshold. I haven't done any of the double threshold days. I'm not sure if I'd be game, solely because of the intensity being difficult to control, and I don't love a treadmill. So, we both run at least on some level for fun, not just for, I run for nothing else because I don't have any significant performance goals that are, tangible or meaningful. But the idea of running on a treadmill to control intensity makes me a little bit uneasy because I don't love running on a treadmill.
No, neither.
I've literally just had one delivered.
Although I love it when it's minus 20 degrees and snowing outside. I don't mind it then.
Yeah, it's a lesser of two evils, and I'll sometimes still go outside and run in the treadmill in the snow. So that speaks volumes to it. Likewise, I have done hard days when I was living in Amsterdam of do I go run in this horrid rain or do I do 3 hours on a treadmill?
Yeah.
And the treadmill will run out sometimes, and sometimes the outside one out. And I had to wring out my insoles from my shoes. So I can go both ways on it. So we'll see. I mean, it's something I'd love to experiment with because I think it'd be an interesting thing. But I think you also need to be measuring lactate, to be honest. And lactate can be used a number of ways. There's lactate that is used to then dial in and prescribe an intensity. And there's lactate that is used to validate your current intensity, right? So your thresholds, specifically, or the way you accumulate lactate, because it's a concentration, right? Millimole is a concentration, will change based on different things. So hydration status, all these things will change the amount of lactate that is there. So understanding that and the limitations of it, and even measuring it is difficult. There's lactate in sweat, and if you're sweating and trying to take this, then you can get a false reading. So you need to be pretty skilled, pretty good at it, and have some good experience to do it. It's not to say don't. It's definitely accessible, but it's going to take some time for you to get it right. So I would be wanting to have a lactate meter and actually doing my lactates on this sort of stuff to make sure I was going the right intensity, because it would be easy to go a touch hard and then really absolutely cook yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I've done a couple of them, but I don't feel like I can really speak to the benefits of them, because I think you can only really understand if they're worthwhile doing them if you do them repeatedly over and over again. And I've sort of, in a very rookie manner, just thrown one in every now and then just to see what it's like. And I don't really have much to say. It's tough. Pretty tired the next day, but that's about all I can say. I'm definitely interested in maybe experimenting with it a little bit more, but I will say that I think anyone listening that is relatively new to running should probably be a little bit careful about this stuff, because you have to remember that Jakob and these guys that are doing these double threshold days and the Kenyans that are doing them very intensely, these guys normally have a good 10 plus years of pretty high mileage under their belt before they're doing this stuff, and that's really important to understand.
The other thing to understand there is they got to where they are doing other stuff.
Yes.
So if you want to be Jakob...
They got to doing what they did by doing 130, 140k a week for 4 years or more.
But also not doing this stuff. They had really solid, I don't want to say basic, but rudimentary entry-level programs until that wasn't working anymore. Then they changed it to a more intermediate program and they step up from there. Nobody started doing lactate testing when they were 10 years old and became the world's best runner. That just isn't necessary. So what I would say, the way to think about training is not how do I do what the best are doing, it's what lessons have they learned that apply to me. And some of them apply, right? Intensity control applies. There's no question. Making hard days hard enough and easy days not so hard, that makes sense for everybody, right? Those are principles that you can take from their training to yours and use, and then you should. What you shouldn't take is I need to be doing that training to be them. They didn't do that training to become them. They do that training now that they are them. Mm. So it's important to train like they used to more than it is to train like they are currently. And that's sometimes hard to know, but most coaches will be able to guide you in that, even in the intermediate stuff. There's two concepts I like here. So thinking about training like this as a trump card, you get to play it whenever you want, but if you play it early enough, you're out. So you may stagnate on that, and then where do you go, right? So if you're already doing double threshold days, do you go to a triple threshold day? What happens there? So you should be using it later as a trump card. The other thing is earning the right. So you kind of need to earn the right to do these, and earning that right is you've run a lot already, you've understood intensity control in other ways, you've used other technologies. Because like I don't see a great deal of a value in lactate testing if you don't understand heart rate. Like it just doesn't make sense to me to go get lactate testing done if you haven't understood heart rate and you haven't understood even feel. And all this stuff is ultimately about dialing in your feel with corroboration from technology. It's not about being reliant on the technology, right? Jakob isn't taking any lactates during his 10K at the World Championships. He's not doing them, right? He's probably not even doing them afterwards. So it's worthwhile considering that.
Yeah. I have understood that Jakob does multiple days a week of double threshold as well. Like oftentimes, I'm not sure if I've seen 3, but at least 2 quite often. So yeah,
it's in Marius back and talks about Tuesday, Thursday, and then the Saturdays are often hills.
Yeah.
And yeah, look, it makes some sense. Again, I strongly doubt Jakob's doing that all year round. I do think he's doing probably a little bit of speed work at some point. He's probably doing a bit more, something that looks a bit more like what most people consider base building. I would also say that you got to remember as well for Jakob, like he races quite a bit. Middle distance runners particularly race frequently, and that in itself is a stimulus at race pace speed stuff. So it's worthwhile considering that he probably doesn't need to do a ton of race pace stuff because he races frequently enough. So then that is your race pace stimulus, right? If you can run multiple marathons a year, right, 6, 8, 10, you would in the goal of running a fast marathon.
Yeah. So the week that he's got laid out here, and about halfway down the article, is Monday 15k easy in the morning, 12k easy in the 15k in the morning, 12k in the evening. Threshold Tuesday morning, AM, PM. Wednesday easy 16k in the morning, easy 10k in the evening, and then Thursday same as Tuesday.
Yep.
Threshold. So these thresholds, he actually doesn't specifically say them in this training week, but I do know, having heard from people close to Jakob, Norwegian runners, that it's probably the most classic day I've heard of. It'd be good to hear what you've heard. Is 5 by 6 minutes in the morning at threshold. So this is not all out. This is not 100% effort. This is a controlled threshold. So they're trying to be around that 2 millimole per litre, which one would say is probably like 80% effort. Maybe something like that. Probably 75.
Maybe even less than
that.
Like
70.
This is what people don't understand. Like it's super controlled for them.
Yeah.
Like yes, it's fast on the treadmill, but it is controlled.
Yeah. Minute rest. For 5 by 6 minutes with a minute rest in the afternoon. I have heard of them doing the same thing again, but more commonly something like 2400s with 30 seconds rest at around about 68 to 70 seconds, which for them is pretty easy.
Similar
this guy's running 54 seconds per lap in his 1500s. And in his 5k races, he's running 62s. So 68 to 70 is really controlled. For a guy running a 15-minute 5k, that's probably the equivalent of doing like 77, 78 per lap.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, that's it's pretty comfortable. It's just tick over, another lap. So this is not, they might look scary, but these guys are probably finishing the days not super drained. So that's the most classic. So back to the training week. Friday, so Tuesday, Thursday, it's a double threshold. Friday is just 2 easy runs. Saturday, like you pointed out earlier, tends to be a high intensity hill workout. I know Jakob has done them as well. I'm actually not super clear on what that looks like. I think it's something like 400s to 1Ks up hills. And then Sunday, an easy, in this particular week, easy 21k run.
Yeah.
So,
and thinking about that weekly volume, back to that earn the right principle and all those things, most people can't handle that volume.
No.
There's no point, if you can't handle that volume, to even try to do a double threshold day, right? So it's worthwhile considering that. If you read the article, or if listeners read the article, you'll notice there that he talks a lot about total volume being such a key thing. Total weekly volume, but also total volume of work at a higher intensity, right? And he talks about 180 Ks a week he was running. Marius Bakken, that is. And so like 180 Ks a week is more than a lot of elite marathoners are running. So it's worthwhile considering, it's always a risk to look at one aspect of a training program and understand. It's like saying, oh, this cake tastes good because there's sugar in it. It's like, well, what else is there? Because sugar by itself doesn't taste like this, right? So double thresholds by themselves don't do it. It's double thresholds in the context of all of that and accumulating them, to your point about, I tried them a couple of times. Like it's about doing them week in, week out, over time, and then seeing the change in your lactate profile and what those speeds can be, right? So at that same lactate, your speed should increase. And that's the whole goal, is how do I run faster for the same effort, right? Or the same output, right? So the same work, how do I run faster, right? So that's the goal, because you have a limit at the moment, right? You can run 30 minutes at a certain pace. It's how do I run faster for 30 minutes? Or how do I run that same distance in less time?
Yeah. Another example here, we see the same. This is a quote from the website, Marius Buchan's link in the show notes. We see the same successful structure of 3:33 1500 meters Swedish runner Kalle Berglund, a runner mentioned to have copied the Ingebrigtsen training a couple of years ago. So some of the I'm not going to go through the full week, but some of the threshold days look like in the morning 5 by 6 minutes, 1 minute rest, 2.5 millimole per liter, and then in the afternoon 10 by 1k. 1 minute rest at 3.5 millimole per liter, and then on the Thursday 5 by 2k in the morning, and which is pretty similar to the 5 by 6 minutes. It's almost the same thing for someone like Kalle, who's probably doing his 2ks in about 6 minutes. This is a guy that's run, I think he's run 13 mid for 5k. Well, he's run 3:33 1500. In the afternoon 25 400s with 30 seconds rest. Yeah. So these workouts are all pretty similar. They tend to be right around that minute to 6 minute reps. It seems like the lower you go in terms of time, the rest goes down to 30 seconds, up to 6 minutes, and 2k it's 1 minute. But it's all short rest. I've never seen anything longer than a minute rest. So it's just heart rate up to threshold, quick rest, heart rate up to threshold, quick rest, and you could probably do whatever you want here. You could probably do 2k, 1k, 2k, 1k, 500, 2k, just as long as the rest is short and and
as long as the intensity is controlled, right? This is the whole thing.
Exactly, the intensity is the key thing.
This is something that he could probably do for half an hour plus.
Yeah.
Now he's breaking it up with rest periods in it. And it's worthwhile noting that. So if he can handle it for 35 minutes and he's doing 35 minutes of total work at it with rests in there, that isn't hard.
No.
Right? If I ask most people to do that sort of intensity, they'd be really, really happy with that sort of thing. So it's worthwhile considering that. And that's so key here is he's not going and doing a 30-minute threshold twice a day. Like that's not what's happening. He's not like doing that.
That would be mentally draining.
Yeah, and emotionally draining, right? And that's such a big part of overtraining, right? Which we mentioned in the previous episode, right?
Overlooked, in my opinion, as well.
Oh, yeah, massively.
Yeah.
And then there's the injury component as well. In terms of the output, yes, this is faster running, but it's not that much faster than an easy run for them. Maybe, a little bit, but not a great deal, right? And it's much less fast than something more. And again, if you think about the role of tendons, the faster you run, the more work there is on a tendon, which is kind of what they're getting at as well here.
Strongly recommend looking more at this link. There is a lot of interesting quotes. They talk a little bit about Hichimilga Rouge, his training in doing similar things in training, although I think most of his training was very steady, sort of 40 to 60 minute runs at about 3 minute K pace, from what I've understood. I mean,
it's nice, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, this guy ran. He still has the world record for the 1500 in an era that's a bit questionable. So this link is really interesting actually, and they talk a little bit about the triathletes as well. Norwegian triathletes and some of their training. So thank you so much for Marius for putting this up on the internet.
Yeah. There's a mention of a young Sondre Moen as well.
Yeah.
For those interested.
Yeah.
So I think it probably covers double threshold days pretty well.
Yeah.
Appreciate all the listeners. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Please like us, rate us, share us. Social media, we're on Instagram, and you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts.
Yep.
And thanks very much.
Every few episodes we like to answer a listener's question as well. So if you have a question or a topic that you find interesting that we haven't covered, please do go over the podcast to make sure we haven't already covered it. But if we haven't already covered it, please do send in. We do like to hear feedback and answer questions that we might find interesting as well. So thank you to those that have sent in questions already. And once again, appreciate you listening in.